So when you start thinking through the principles of best practices, it's really best to think about this in each of the subsets. So in the prevention category, we have the hiring practices. That's something we will be talking about today. How do we strengthen our screening processes for our potential and our current employees? How do we know that the people who are coming to our schools or who are at our schools are people who should be with our children? The second one, which is really complicated and really takes a lot of time to digest and will take time for each school to think through the process, is the whole issue of boundary establishment and enforcement. How do we establish boundaries? And it's really difficult in our world as independent school educators because we, as a community, sometimes work very hard to kind of blur that distinction. We use phrases like "you're in our family," and we use those types of that type of language that really causes boundaries to not be sometimes as clear as they should be. But we recognize from past practice and past situations that in fact sometimes those are the situations that have gotten us into some of the difficulties for some of the schools that have experienced this already. We then have a section called Sound Business and Employment Termination Practices, because again, as we analyze this, we recognize there's some pieces in here in past practices that have caused some of these situations to not only occur, but then to reoccur. And so you'll see some strong recommendations there. And then finally is the issue of creating a safe and informed school community. How do we help children and the entire community understand what may be happening to them and they're not even aware that it is happening to them? They're being created, they're being groomed, or something along those lines. So that's in the whole prevention side. So if you think of this as two parts. One is the prevention piece, and we have a lot of work to do as a community, and we know that this will take time to put into place, but it's very important work. The second one is how do we respond to allegations of current and past sexual misconduct? What are some of the things a school should consider, and what are some of the actions a school should take? And some schools in this room have already dealt with this. You've been dealing with this. And we all know the type of dislocation it causes and the consternation within the community that it causes when this happens, when this allegation happens. We have a school just a couple days ago that this happened, and they're now in the process of going through resolving the past allegations. And how do you deal with that? So that's the point of what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of work this from the macro picture, and Caryn's going to help us with the macro, and then we're going to move more into the granular, and we have Austin and company here to help us with that. We also want to use at the very end, and we do want this to be a dialogue and a question and answer. This is being live streamed, so just be aware of that. That whatever we're saying in here is not just staying in here. There's people out there who are watching this right now, and so we are live streaming this. So that's important also to be aware of. But at the end, what we really want to do from the NYSAIS perspective is we want to solicit your input on ways that NYSAIS can support you as you begin to think through your entire community and how will you go about preventing and responding to sexual misconduct and abuse. So I'm going to turn it over to Caryn, who's going to spend some time talking to us about this entire topic. And Caryn, I'll let you.
Can you hear me okay? Right, has anyone ever not been able to hear me okay? Shrinking violet that I am. Look, first I want to start this out by just saying that I really respect and admire NYSAIS and Mark through your leadership on this topic. I have to say, as you know, I've been in the middle of this room many times on a Friday morning, speaking in front of you and letting you and talking about some of the hot topics that we've seen. And how many years in a row do I think I've spoken about sexual misconduct and protecting kids, and especially these sexual abuse cases? I feel like I'm a broken record at this point because what's my refrain always? Safety and security of our students is our #1 priority. Safety and security of our students is our #1 priority. And I feel like over the last 5 years, I've been saying it more and louder and with more concern than ever before. And I don't know how many of you have met my associate Janice Gregerson, who's here with me, but over the last year and a half, 2 years, we have handled some very horrific cases, extremely horrific cases. And I don't know, did anyone hear me at NBOA this year? You know how they have that ask the lawyer. Well, usually I'm not very dry, and I'm pretty, gregarious, and I have a joke or two in my pocket. But my presentation was about how we absolutely need to be taking this stuff seriously. And I got some bad reviews from NBOA this year because people said she had such a serious topic. Well, I think this is a really serious topic, and I think we really need to be addressing it because, again, Janice and I have seen things that I hope that no one in this room ever has to hear. When Mark first approached me with helping out with this, creating this policy or best practice, I thought it was a great idea, and I've talked to a lot of other associations around the country who are not nearly as far ahead as NYSAIS is and have not dealt with it as much as you have, and that's really great, Mark. I think you're doing a yeoman's job. What we're seeing, again, in the industry right now is two pieces. First, we're dealing a lot still with these old alumni cases, and I've spoken to many of you in the room about some of these where someone will come forward, or a number of alumni will come forward, making allegations that they've been, when they were a student at the school, they were abused by a teacher or some other adult. It's not always a teacher, actually. And, they're now raising that with you, and they want you to be aware of it, and they actually want you to deal with it or address it. Now, a lot of times the statute of limitations has already run on these situations, so it's not as if you owe them any money under the law. But that doesn't mean that we should not be dealing with them and we should not be addressing them. And I know that a lot of you have been reading a lot of the articles and a lot of the reports and a lot of the various ways that schools are dealing with those. And I encourage you to keep doing that. And you've heard me say this, that I think as part of that, it's extremely, extremely important that you put in place your, three-part professional team, meaning if God forbid you should ever get one of these calls, the lawyer you're going to use, the crisis management group that you may be using, and there's lots of great crisis management folks out there, but you want to interview people now, put them into place now so that when the call comes, you are prepared. And quite frankly, that's not just for the alumni abuse, but that's for the current abuse or for anything. You're much better served by having someone that you already know that already has your school's culture in mind. And then the last part is to identify an investigator, because often what we do, again, on these alumni abuse cases is that we do an investigation, and quite frankly, we should be doing those with the current abuse cases as well. There's lots of great people out there. There's references made Mark mentioned the NAIS TABS white paper, and if you haven't read it, it's not an easy read, but it's not a difficult read, but you should just skim it. It's a really good, it gives you a good overview, but it also gives you a lot of references in there for different folks that work in this space. And we worked with them to help, and provided a couple of the resources that we use. So again, as Mark talked about, the two parts, the current and the former. I think I've talked about the former, and we've talked about this alumni abuse a lot. There's a lot to read about it, but I think what almost concerns me more right now is the current abuse matters that are coming up that Janice and I and my team are dealing with, because we all say, oh, it's terrible, I can't believe those things happened, but they still happen. And every time we get a call where, a head of school will say, oh, we have this employee, and here's the complaint we got about him, and we then start talking to the head of school or the business manager, whoever it is, well, have you ever gotten any complaints before? Well, yeah, we have. Well, what are those complaints? Well, he does have a tendency to go in his room with the door closed with a couple of students, but we've talked to him about it. We've talked to him about it a number of times. Well, does he still do it? Yeah, he still does it, but we've talked to him about it. Or he gives gifts to kids. He has a couple kids he really likes and he's really close with. Their parents are getting divorced, or they're bullied, or some other explanation for why the teacher gives this one student gifts. Nicknames is another thing. Oh yeah, he has nicknames for certain kids. Oh, he's just a very touchy-feely kind of teacher, or she is a very touchy-feely kind of teacher. And we start having this conversation, and these are all signs of grooming. It's classic grooming behavior. And when we see this, and we know that a school has been identifying this grooming behavior but hasn't been dealing with it, Those are all signs. Now, does it necessarily mean that the person's an abuser? No. But are they indicators? Yes. And we still see these things on a regular basis. So as part of what, again, the two parts that NYSAIS has created for you in terms of best practice is the what do we do before you bring someone in, which Hope and is going to speak to, and Hope and Michael will speak to. But there's the other piece, which is really important to me as well, which is we have people there now currently that are behaving in ways that should set off flags, set off ringers, make us think this is not appropriate behavior. And we need to be watching that, and we need to be making sure that, A, we're training our faculty and staff on boundaries, as Mark said, and that's really important. But as we all know, it's like when we say to teachers, oh, you can't do this. You can't just teach you can't do these 5 things. You have to explain that there's a general sense of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of communicating and interacting with students. But again, I think that training is really key, and I encourage everybody to make sure that you're doing that training piece. And also the evaluations, making sure that we're doing evaluations of employees and that those issues that you're watching or you're seeing during the course of the year, you're addressing in the evaluation. And when they don't change, you take action. So those are also very, very important issues. The other thing, what's interesting to us and what we're seeing is that, often these complaints will come forward. I mean, we're dealing with a matter right now where over the years, a number of teachers came forward to complain about this one teacher and different behaviors that they saw him participate in. So one of the behaviors was these teachers were at a park with the students and they saw the teacher rub his hand along an 8th grader's bare leg, hand to leg. And the other teacher said, what? And went after they came back from the park to the head and said, we saw this behavior and it was very unsettling. And the head of school said, well, sometimes those things happen. Maybe he was just passing by her and his hand brushed against her leg. And the teacher said, no, that's not what happened. We saw him do this. And it comes to find out there's been a number of situations like that. So the problem becomes when you have one person who's the only person who's taking these complaints and addressing them. So we want to look at various ways of making sure that it's not just one person that takes these claims, but a number of people that could possibly take these various kinds of complaints. So they're being addressed and we're dealing with them. But again, from the bigger granular or bigger overarching philosophy, we want to make sure that we have some sort of policies and procedures that deal with all of these issues. And I know everyone's always very sensitive to policies and procedures, but we do want to make sure that they are in place because we want to be able to look back to them should we ever get a claim or some sort of charge filed against us that, look, we have these policies and procedures in place and we're making sure that we're following them, and you have the process for making sure that people know how to report, and that after they report, we actually do this investigation. I guess we can, any questions? Comments? Nancy?
So does do these guidelines and report also address adult to adult in the community and even more specifically student to student, or is it just adult to student? Can you repeat the question?
Well, the question was, does it address just adult to student, or is there adult to adult inappropriate, like sexual misconduct, like sexual abuse or sexual...
Also student to student.
And student to student. I would say it doesn't address student to student, or, Mark, would you agree, student to student or adult to adult? I think the purpose of this is really to address bringing in safe, making sure that the people that we bring into our community are safe. And that includes, or at least for the part that's the coming, not the historical abuse, but the part that's coming in. And it's not just employees. I mean, you're talking about employees, visitors, parents. There's a piece of this that discusses things like, who do we allow, what's the process that we use to allow people to come into our building? Is there any sort of screening? And I don't know, I've seen it a lot in a lot of the schools around the country and a lot in New York. When you come into the front door, you have to give your I can't think of the name, but there's a number of companies that do it. But you have to give your driver's license, and it runs your name through the pedophile registry. Does anybody use one of these? Yeah, a lot of people use it, and it's very good. As a matter of fact, we had, last week, we had a call from one of our clients who said that they had an applicant, I love these stories, they had an applicant that was coming to their school to apply for a job. He was coming in to do his interview and also do his classroom, his presentation, and he popped up on the pedophile website. He gave his driver's license, and he came up as a positive because he was on a pedophile registry. So we didn't hire him. We didn't even let him come in. But I think it's a helpful process. Look, it's not just also even applicants. We have to be addressing things like parents. I mean, I'm sure that more than one of you has had a situation where one of your parents in your school is on one of the registries. Anybody have any of these situations, and how do we deal with the pedophile parent, if you will, and what our responsibilities are on those fronts? And that is addressed in this as well. And how do you make sure that we're identifying those folks, and what do you do when you have one of those folks? Again, when we think about this, the purpose of it is to make sure that we're creating safe environments. And how is it that we can ensure that the kids, or hopefully empower the kids and ensure that the adults that we put in contact with them are safe? So isn't that part of our what we are as independent schools, is to make sure that adults are having good relationships with kids, and we encourage those kinds of relationships. So we want to make sure that they're, actually exposing them to safe folks.
You're good with time.
I'm good with time. Oh, good. Let's see then. Okay, so I guess let me just finish up a little bit more of this in terms of this. The other thing I want to make sure that we are also thinking about not only is and we're going to talk about hiring, so I don't want to go too much into the hiring process, but the other pieces around our community. So in other words, we have been talking a lot to schools about physical plant, and about how do we look at our physical plant to make sure that there aren't various spaces around the school, right, where an adult and a student could somehow find kids and kids also, but that we can monitor those spaces. So we've been doing a lot of these security audits. Anybody do a security audit yet? And I would encourage you to do a security audit if you haven't. It's not expensive. But one of the things they do is really look around and see where those dark spots are. And we've been encouraging schools to put in more cameras. And I hate to say put in more cameras. I know we're shaking our heads, but I think it's it is valuable. And we had a case not that long ago where a student made an allegation against a teacher, and we said, well, where did this happen? And the teacher obviously denied it, and the student said, well, it happened over here. And we happened to have a camera there, which was perfect, because we pull out the camera, and lo and behold, yeah, this teacher had cornered this kid had pushed this kid into a corner, basically. So the more that you can do those kinds of things, I think the better we all are. Let's start maybe looking at the hiring process.
Sure. So do you want to go through that? I think what we'll do is, one of the things that NYSAIS did is, after we developed this principles of best practice, is we then spent time with one of our partners, which is Austin & Company, and talked about how this impacts the schools and what does this really mean from an insurance point of view. And then we have one of the people I think is one of the best experts in HR, which is Hope, who was really was willing to help us develop some resources for you. So I'm going to turn this over maybe to Michael first. Is that okay? Sure. And then we'll come over to Hope, and then we'll continue on.
So the good news is most of Austin & Company's material today is Hope, not me. But the bad news is there's no motorcycles this year. So I don't know if anybody attended last year, and that still is getting mixed reviews. So we left any motor vehicles out of this one. But I thought it would be beneficial just to sort of set the table in this discussion on the perspective of the insurance industry. Most of you probably know when there is a sexual abuse and molestation allegation, that you usually rely upon your liability insurance to take over the defense and to protect the school. And they sort of steer the cart from there forward. So maybe giving you some perspective on that industry's viewpoint or the mechanics of how it works might be helpful, but most of our content today is what Hope will talk to you about the administrative process and some of the things we're at work on for you. That picture up there, though, is included by design to try to illustrate an idea, something that people in our world, the world of risk management, spend a lot of time thinking about. And it's called the iceberg principle. Now, all of you that probably teach science in your part-time know that most of the iceberg is actually below the waterline. You just see the tip of the iceberg. That's an important illustration because there's a similar theme here. A lot of times we're surprised on how low the cost can be occasionally for a sexual abuse and molestation lawsuit, for defense costs, and for the ultimate settlement. It isn't usually $10, $20, or $30 million kind of thing. But like a lot of incidents like this, the actual cost is much bigger than the insurance benefit or coverage that applies, that being paying for the attorneys and paying for the ultimate judgment or settlement, the money that goes to the plaintiff. And these other areas, the impact it has, contribute to the total cost of that risk. We've had to be on the other side of those phone calls with many of you, wherein there's just an allegation. It doesn't even get to a lawsuit. And all of a sudden, the school starts incurring all of these painful, indirect costs that you see sort of bulleted there for you. So keep in mind, there's many things that while you can have the best insurance in the world, that are not insurable. And there's some real cultural interruption that happens at a school when these things surface. So, push forward up.
Are you going to, though there are those benefits too that you get in terms of, from some of the providers that, such as the coverage for the investigation and coverage for the...
Caryn always gives me a great segue. I like that.
Sell your wares.
There you go. One component of the insurance program that all of you have that are clients of ours is some value added to help connect you with before that lawsuit happens. While there's just an allegation or a concern something inappropriate might have happened, there's costs that you start incurring, some of which can be offset by this bundle of value added that we usually include for you. And that is to pay for an investigator, to pay for a media consultant or a PR firm, and a host of other things. This is probably a good time to point out that the #1 best practice we're focused on is as soon as you hear about an allegation or a concern, pick up the phone to us right away.
Right.
Not in a month or a year kind of thing. Every insurance policy has a condition in it that says you're required to give timely notice to the insurance company. And it's not defined as a number of days or a number of hours or a number of weeks. There is some latitude for the insurance company to make a decision. And this is true even in your personal life, that if you have a homeowner's claim, you're required to give timely notice to your insurance company, or they don't have to pay the claim. So by getting us involved early, it gives the insurance carrier a voice in the conversation. It gets you access to those benefits and things that you're talking about, Caryn, and it satisfies that timely notice requirement.
Yeah, and I can't overstate that. That is, you know, as soon as the client calls me, one of the first things I always say is, did you call your insurance provider? And they say, well, we don't know if it is anything yet. And I always say, that's right, so call your insurance provider, call Austin, let them know, because if you don't, then you know, there's no downside to putting the insurance provider on notice. Again, the only, sometimes a little bit of a risk could be, it's not even a risk, I mean, because it's privileged communication that once we disclose someone's name, but it's always worth calling. And I have to tell you how important it is also, because those benefits, sometimes what's most costly in these things is the investigation or is the crisis management team, right? Because, for example, in New York, the statute of limitations for all these alumni cases has gonna, you know, in general, is long gone. So there's not gonna be any case that can be brought against a New York school. Having said that, that doesn't mean the cost of doing an investigation or doing a, you know, the crisis management isn't expensive. And so, especially some of them have really good lists of folks you can use, and you go right on there and it's all covered, right?
We never really say it's all covered. We encourage you to contact us.
Michael tells me it's always covered. He takes care of you.
Robert?
Yeah, I think a lot of people know this, but if you comment on the carriers, not the carrier, because you're going back.
Yeah.
And,
Good point.
you know, my comment, Mark, a long time ago, is make sure you have all your policies. And then we had the problem of mergers, trying to find out who was the insurance company.
Yeah.
Sure. So
They're bankrupt, or, you know.
the first bullet up there takes us right to that point, Robert.
Could you repeat the question?
Robert had some thoughts about accessing the carriers, maybe that insured you many years ago, and how they've merged and evolved, and trying to do the forensics, I think, is the direction you were headed.
And a really good point to add to your document retention and destruction policy, which I know you all have, and you keep updated on a regular basis, is to make sure that you, because it used to be that we, you know, years ago, you wouldn't include keep all insurance policies from the year one. But now we absolutely do that. There's no statute of limitations on keeping those insurance policies. Sorry, Michael.
No problem. So there's some good news and bad news. The good news is if you're an Austin & Company client, we have records that can connect you to what your insurance was all the way back to 1991. Now, obviously, if you became a client in 2003, we have data going back to 2003. But our system has maintained who you were insured with and who your policy number was back to 1991. Prior to that, it's going to be more cumbersome to find anything out. That's important because of the bullet that you see up there. That the insurance that defends these types of claims is what's called occurrence-based, which means the policy that's provided the day the event happened, not the day the allegation comes up, not the day that you notify us, the day the occurrence itself happened. So that's what drives a lot of the thinking around this. Now, frankly, most insurance carriers and most insurance firms like us are only required under the law to keep 7 years of records of who you're insured with. There is somewhat of a practice in the industry at large, 7 years and 1 day later, throw everything out as fast as you can, and then it's incumbent upon you, the policyholder, to prove where you had your insurance. We, as sort of a custodian of this, and since we've had a relationship with NYSAIS going back to the 70s, in the early 90s resolved to try to retain at least some summary information so we can help you access that. Does that answer your point, Robert? At least in general terms?
But you can see the pain in his face.
Yes, it is.
The pain still exists. But isn't there, though, Michael, you still can get that coverage for, some of the insurance providers still give you the coverage even if the event didn't happen on their time, on their clock.
It depends on quite a few factors. I would say generally, though, that if you have a large case with a lot of defense costs and maybe multiple plaintiffs, getting an insurance company to give any meaningful coverage prior to the date you were insured with them isn't likely to go well.
No, I mean like for the investigation.
Yes, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
So I know, Robert, you went through this quite a bit. Maybe you could real briefly share the amount of time and effort that it took for you to recreate this.
He's still going.
Can I give you the microphone, Robert? Thank you.
It probably took a third to a half of my time for several years, frankly. It was unbelievable. And we had something that went over decades and multiple insurance companies, and we had some policies, we couldn't find some policies. Even when we found numbers of policies, the insurance company didn't have the policy, so we really didn't know what our coverage limits were. One insurance company had been going bankrupt, and we had to deal with the state. It was horrible. A lot of time. And the head's a lot of his time, too.
Yeah.
So
And the cost is enormous.
the next bullet I'll hit you with that maybe people don't realize is this, like any other type of litigation, once you turn the claim over to the insurance company and you want them to pay for that defense, you want them to pay for the judgments and settlements, it's their show. They can make the decision of what to settle at, and if you will not agree to that, it often pivots back to happening on your dime.
Hey,
That's a
Michael, I'm going to interrupt you too, because we had insurance companies fighting with each other
Certainly.
because of the different times, and we almost sued one of the insurance companies. So it was a nightmare.
For the record, that's not the period that Polly was insured with us. But before that slope starts declining too fast. So.
Yeah, no, and that happens. It's not uncommon at all because, again, especially if you have someone, and this is, I guess what we're trying to say is you want to take care of your house now because you see what happened historically when people didn't take care of their house. So we want to avoid this ever from happening again. What Robert is referring to and what we're sort of, I don't want to say snickering about, but are cases that are these alumni abuse cases. And sadly, 90s is one point in time, the cases that we're working on, you're looking at more like the 60s and the 70s. A lot of these cases are people that were teachers, coaches, Boy Scouts. They also worked at the Connected Summer Camp. I mean, they just really had themselves in a lot of various areas of these kids' lives, and so the abuse was horrific, and it was in multiple locations and multiple times, which is complicated by the fact also that since it's over a course of time, we don't always have the same insurance carriers over years, but I think it's a good segue into why it's so important that we make sure that now what we're doing, we avoid these kinds of things so the people that come after us don't have to be worrying about this.
So our next bullet, if you take, and it's hard to do so, especially as a parent, to take the human side out of this. We all know that the first and most important consideration is we want to do right by children. We want to be safe and have a safe environment for kids. The more mercenary part of the conversation that the insurance industry brings to the discussion is defendability. One of the things we're seeking, one of the things we always want from a client is to equip us to defend that lawsuit that you had done everything reasonable ahead of time to prevent it from happening. The parallel I would give you is that the most common lawsuit insurance gets involved in is a slip and fall. The insurance industry loves clients that shovel their sidewalk and keep a log of when they put salt on that sidewalk. So if someone slips and falls, okay, we know that's part of why you buy insurance, but did you equip us to defend that suit effectively? It's the same theme here. Again, the mercenary interest of the insurance company, and they're good people, they care about the kids and what's happened to them, but have you equipped us to say that you have met the reasonable standard of care and done everything that could be expected? The benchmark that we bring to this discussion is what happens in a public school district? Kind of in the same way that we've spoken to you on concussions, that now there is an expected standard of care in New York State of how an athletic trainer in a public school district is supposed to respond to a head injury and a concussion. Well, you're likely to be judged by that standard even though the law doesn't specifically speak to you. The same is true here, that the background check and fingerprinting process in a public school or in a charter school is very aggressive and state-of-the-art. Our fear or our thought, our perspective, if you will, would be that's the expected standard of care, and the closer you get to that, you're much more defendable, again, from our self-interest in the discussion. I think we have one more slide before you take over.
I think that was it.
That's it, okay.
Can we heighten that standard just a little bit, though? I would think that in terms of the criminal background checks, I would agree with you that that's definitely the standard we want to make sure, but there's not the kind of expectation with some of the other things that I would hope that Hope is going to talk about, and my argument would be that we have a duty. I think for us the standard should be higher. What the state requires us to do should be the floor, not the ceiling, and that we should be doing a much higher. You're right. We should definitely be doing at least what they require us to do. But as Hope is going to describe, the protocol that we've worked up and that we want to make sure to the closest that you can follow in terms of background checks is much higher. And when I say background checks, it's not just criminal, but it's all those things that we use to vet an applicant so that you create, a tight net so the folks that we don't want to be exposed to kids don't get through the door.
So one of the things that we did is we looked at the hiring practices, and we know that within this room and within every one of the NYSAIS schools, we have this wide range of personnel practices, HR practices. We have very large schools that have large staffs. We have small schools that are maybe a staff of one or two. And varying degrees of understanding of HR So we felt that what we would provide for you is, for all schools, is a principal best practice around hiring practice, and give you basically what we think is you should be doing. Now, I'll preface this with, for Hope, because I know she's going to say it anyway, which is, this is a draft. I mean, we're working this process through ourselves to make sure that we're coming up with something that you could say, okay, this is the checklist we're going to do, and this has been fully vetted, and this is compliance with the various laws here in the state of New York. So Hope has been, and her staff, and Stacy have been really phenomenal at helping us put together this initial draft. And I'm going to turn over to Hope, who's going to talk a little bit about hiring practices.
Okay. Thank you. So I think everybody else did a great job of setting the table for why we're here this morning. From our perspective in HR, Stacy and I work in schools every day, and we know that things have not changed. Regulations haven't changed. You still need to comply with certain requirements, whether you have nursery school-age children, if you're located in New York City. I mean, there's a lot of different things that impact the decisions that you make. But as Caryn had said, there's so many stories in the media. They've gotten a hold of this. There's lawsuits. So, and then the NYSAIS best practices, obviously, this is a fantastic job of putting everything together so we all have common responsibilities. We all know what we're going to do on the NYSAIS level. So it's not a new topic. But I think from the HR standpoint, we need to talk about the hiring process, which is just one piece of this. So if we can prevent these individuals from coming into our schools, it puts us that much further ahead in prevention, right? So that's kind of where Stacy and I come into this, which is how can we make all of this happen? So we've talked to a lot of schools. We know everybody has different regulations they need to comply with, different processes. You may be doing background checks, fingerprinting already. So it's kind of all over the board. There isn't one set process that we can share. So our goal was to kind of come up with the template checklist, some hiring practices that you can start with, and then maybe take a look at what you're currently doing and enhance those so they best meet your needs. So we encourage everyone, obviously, to continue following whatever state, local requirements that they have. The NYSAIS best practices, if you haven't seen it already, I know we've been talking about it, it lays out everything for you. We took our current documentation that we had that we use with clients, and we've kind of tweaked it a little bit based on some of the information that was in the best practices. We want to make sure that we create our consistent practices, and maybe the people in this room, you may not be the ones who are doing that administrative tactical work. You may have other people in the business office doing it. So we want to make sure that we have clear processes that everybody who's responsible in the hiring process has access to and that they're trained on. And we want to train them over and over and over again. We find that you may need to train the person at the front desk. So when a candidate comes in, you're going to want to train them, because it starts at the front door. And Caryn mentioned the security system. That's not on our checklist. Does every person who comes in the school, even the candidates that we're interviewing, go through the same process? That should be on our list. I mean, we want to add that in there. So we created some documentation. Caryn, did you want to add something?
You know what, this best practice is going to really help you. And this is why, again, when we, as you said, and you were Mike was very right about it, which is if we try to create these, insurance likes it if we can help them defend the case, right? That's their benefit. And that's, as a lawyer, I like it if you can help me defend the case. And one great way to do that is to say, look, we take our job very seriously. Safety and security is paramount to us. And so it's so important to us. Our association has set up a list of best practice, and we are going to comply with that list of best practice because we know they have done their due diligence and understand what those best practices are. So if you get, this is a gift to you, right? Here's best practice. Doesn't mean you can't go above it, but I would strongly recommend that you use this as your at least your floor, because it's reasonable, it's not, it's not onerous, and yet it will allow for you to say, here's our best practice, we take it seriously, we're following those best practices.
Good point. All right, so if we can go ahead and make all of this happen, then we do help with our
Way in the back.
Question in the back.
defendability. We have a question.
I think we have one question or two. One.
Thank you. Talking about best practices and the entry-door security check for pedophile and the system, it's wonderful to have best practices, but reality becomes, what if we have a parent, if we have a visitor, we have people that show up as pedophile? How we handle that? What do we say? Who handles it? And where do we go from there? It's quite challenging. It's easier said than done. So I think with best practices, I hope you put some suggestions in place.
Yeah, on all of these things, and Hope is going to give some more detail about some of the policy provisions, but my strong recommendation on all of these things, and I have a strong recommendation on everything, so this shouldn't be different. For the front door piece, you're right, Cece. What people sometimes do is they put this front door, check in, and then, oh my God, we have someone that actually shows up on the website. What are we going to do? What you have to do when you get that is you have to put together a protocol. So if someone shows up as a positive, who's called? And there's a lot of ways that schools do this. One way schools do this is if someone's called, then the head of security is called and the CFO is called, and then someone comes to the front door and has either a discussion with the person, which is not necessarily the way I like it to happen, or has a discussion on their own and then decides how we're going to navigate this person through. So, who is the person? Is it an applicant? Is it an applicant for employment? Is it an applicant that's, having their kid come to apply to school? Are they coming on a visit? And so you just have to outline those protocols pretty clearly so that there's no one is surprised. We had this one that was this applicant, and it comes to find out, because there's a lot of false positives on that thing, I have to tell you, because it's not an exact science. It happened that this person wasn't a false positive, it was a real positive, and we called the person into the head's office because she said, look, if this is a positive, I'm not spending my day interviewing this guy and having him and he basically said, when she brought him in, because that's the protocol there, oh yeah, that was me, but it happened a really long time ago. And she said, okay, and we didn't, go through with the process, because we wouldn't, again, you have to remember, if in fact someone was on the pedophile website, would you consider hiring them as an employee? What do you do if they're a parent? So all those things have to sort of be worked through, but a good policy makes sense. The other thing about all of these issues we're going to talk about with Hope is it's really, really, really helpful that you set up your hiring policy. And anybody who's ever heard me speak about the hiring process knows I like a hiring policy, and I like it really comprehensive. And I think you have to bring in all the people that have input, are participating in this hiring, because you might have someone in the upper, the head of the upper school, head of the middle school, head of the lower school, someone in the AD, and they might all be hiring in different ways. And what you want to do is bring everybody together to the table and come up with a hiring policy so that everyone is doing it consistently across the board. So if we require everyone to come in and do a visit and speak with 3 different people and get 4 different recommendations, whatever it is, but you want to put together a policy so that in the end, just like we say about everything, it can be consistent, and that we know that we're putting everybody through the same process. It's when you don't deviate from that someone either falls through the cracks, or if they do fall through the cracks, then we weaken our argument for how to defend.
And I think when you look at the NAS TABS report, which really is I highly recommend that everybody read the report in detail. In many cases, it was because there was not anything in place.
Right.
They had not thought it through. And so I think if you look at the entire principle of best practice, the underlying theme of the principle of best practice is planning and knowing what to do. So, Cece, when you're in that situation, because you could be in that situation, what are you going to do?
Right.
And one of the things we've talked about in the regional meetings and with our meetings with heads has been, what do you do if you leave this meeting today and you have a reporter from the New York Times saying, do you know about the student in 1995 and this is the allegations against your school? What do you, have you even thought through that? Because the time to be thinking about that is not when you're in the middle of that. The time to be thinking about that is when you have some time to actually reflect on, well, what do we do in that situation? I think if you follow and look at the principles of best practice, that's really the overarching theme of much of this is, do you have in place a plan? Do you know what you're going to do should this rear its head? And in some cases, it very well could. In the case that had just last week, it did. And fortunately, this head was had thought through a lot of this. Anne Marie?
So what we did, I don't know if they laughed.
Could you wait for the mic?
Poor Barbara's getting her exercise.
Barbara's getting her exercise this morning.
Yay, Barbara.
So, see, I'm too loud for this. One of the things we did do, and you had talked about it earlier, was to bring in the team. So we have an investigative firm, we have a PR firm that when we went through the interview process and found people that we were comfortable working with, and we actually brought the communications firm in on a retainer. And
a very reasonable retainer.
it is. And they've been working with us to sort of do these scenarios. So the what if, Cece, when you come up with it, is we practiced. We brought in our crisis team and we sat around a table, and we've done this now 2 or 3 times where we work through a scenario. If this happens, what do we do? What is our first response to the media? What do we, what's the process? Who's going to call who? How are we going to manage this? And it's, while you think you know what you're going to do, and once you get a group of 6 or 8 people in the room and everyone starts going, well, what if this happens? Or what do we do about that? You realize there's so much more to it. But we're finding that the practice of it, to actually work through these scenarios, which we hope to God never happen, but if they do, it still won't be perfect because it's messy and every situation is based on facts. But the fact that we've practiced and have some templates, some toolkits, we're not starting from scratch, because my reading of a lot of this stuff is the first 24 hours in how you handle an incident is pretty much dictates how it's going to go out after that.
And you want to make sure you have your communications person at that table. We sometimes forget about that person. You want the communications person, and Anne Marie interviewed, we worked together with these guys and gave them a number of different people to talk to, and I encourage you to talk to a number of different crisis management groups and a number of different investigators, because not one size doesn't fit all. Obviously, I have the team that I like to work with, but everybody has a different experience. And wasn't it helpful also just to have worked with them before, so when you're ready, you know that when
Yeah, totally.
Let me not
to
speak
have
for you.
everybody on board and understand the culture and understand the voice that the school wants to speak with. And then we've been building a toolkit and protocols that we then vet with Austin and Company and with Caryn. And, we have in a book, every time we add a new protocol for a new crisis that we've worked out, here it is. And we're by no means done. This is an ongoing process that happens all the time. But we're spending time in this area, a lot of time, with a team of people, rather than dumping it on one person, I think has also been helpful.
One of the things we've done is to create for you a resource on the NYSAIS Business Managers listserv microsite, that there's a whole resource tab, and we're putting things in there. And if you don't know, all of you have the ability to upload things into that tab, into that section. So if you've developed a really great policy or procedure or practice or something that you think, I just really want to share this with the other NYSAIS schools, you can put it right in there and everybody has access to that. So we're trying to create this very robust library for you, that you're not all having to recreate the wheel, every single one of you separately, because some schools are further down the road for whatever reason, and other schools are saying, wow, this is really important, we need the resources. So it is there, it's on the NYSAIS Business Managers microsite, which is where the listserv is, and then there's another tab that says resources. Yeah.
Michael or Matthew.
We were preschool.
and a lot of children are dropped off and picked up by caregivers, and they are brought in, they are dropped off at the entrance to the classroom, not at the entrance to the building. And we keep a register of who is an authorized caregiver, and we only turn over the child to the right person, hopefully. But as far as checking these people, some of whom will not have New York State, many of whom will not have New York State driving licenses, what are we supposed to be doing?
Well, a lot of times people don't have the New York State driver's license when they do the pedophile registry. It's a check for all over the country. It's not just a New York State. The bigger issue I would be concerned with those folks is some of them might not have any form of ID that we could check. Look, I know we like to rely on our parents. I just, when it comes to bringing, it's these people that sort of are in the periphery, that's not the right word, but we don't sort of look at, that come in, that can sneak in. You know, it's well known that pedophiles apply to schools where they know the school doesn't do a good background check. It's just well known. I mean, we unfortunately, sadly, we track a lot of this pedophile stuff. So it's important to look at all of that. And you raise a really good point, which is when we're talking about these issues with schools, we say, look at the entire process. Stand at your front door and look at who comes into your door all day long, right? Where are the entry points around, and who comes in and who can come in? And do we know about those people? And if we don't, how do we find out about those people? How about vendors, right? I mean, that's one where we really know that there's substantial liability or substantial exposure for potential injury. The plumber, the person who's coming to work on your HVAC, all of those folks, they're anybody. And remember where they go in your school. They go into nooks and crannies around where dangerous things can happen. I feel like don't you watch out for what's going on in your school. But in some ways, I'm worried about it. All right, I'm worried about it a lot. And maybe I'm just, we've been watching the horror movies for the last 3 years, but we've been watching the horror movies for the last 3 years. So to the extent that you can really, step back, and everybody's heard me say this, I was away the last week and I stepped back and had those big thoughts. I think this is one of those things where you do need to really step back and have those big thoughts, looking around and trying to figure out where are look, I'm risk management, right? Look around and figure out where your weak spots are, and you've just identified a great one. Where's Joan? I'll never forget walking into Joan's building, right? You walk into Joan's building, which is a beautiful school, and have you ever been there, right? And there's all those sofas, and all the nannies are all lined up, right? Waiting for all the kids. And again, they're all in the school, and it's great. Those are the folks that come in, and all the kids know them and are familiar with them because they see them sitting. And they're probably all fine, safe people. I just want us to be thinking about that, because those are the people that we're exposing our kids to.
And so, again, part of the point of this session is to just raise an awareness, help you begin to understand, and so you'll look at the world just a little differently and think it through just a little differently. I'd like to continue on with Hope, because they've spent quite a bit of time just helping us put together the draft of a checklist of best practices, which we're really, if you think about our principal best practice, the 4 categories that I outlined, this is the first one. This is the hiring practices that strengthen the screening of potential and current employees. We're just dealing with that piece. There's all the other pieces that are there. We're certainly not going to be able to cover. We're not going to do all that today, but we will talk at the end about maybe some next steps. So Hope, go ahead.
So that's where we're going to go, just some next steps. Again, this is from the administrative standpoint. So you're probably in the midst of hiring season. You've probably already made some offers of employment. You probably still need to make some. So this is a great time for you to look at your process, especially if this is something you inherited. If you're new at the school and you inherited somebody else's processes, you may want to take a closer look at that. So we created the onboarding scorecard, and everyone should have gotten a copy, and we'll make sure it's on the website. But you may want to go through this and take a look at this now, or have the other people in your office who are responsible for the administration go through this and rate yourself and see where you fit in. with what you're doing today. You may need to make a few enhancements. You may be doing everything okay. You may decide you want to do additional. But this is a great place to start for the hiring process. Again, the principles of best practice don't go into effect immediately, obviously, but this is going to be a great way to help you get there. So we encourage you to look at the draft scorecard. We also created an employment checklist. So this is typically what we go through, or we would go through in the hiring process. Again, perfect time for you to take a look at what you're doing, what your current practices are, and how extensive they are. We ask people all the time, are you doing background checks? They say yes. And we say to them, do you know what's included in your background check? Do you know what you're checking? And most people don't. A lot of people don't because they might have inherited that process. So we encourage you to really take a thorough look at that.
And when you're talking about the background check, are you talking about a check that you're using a third party for doing that check?
Right. So right now, we talk to a lot of people, they're using Sterling or Hire Right or something like that for the criminal background check. Not everybody's doing the fingerprinting right now. So, but we encourage you, if you're using a Sterling, who we know has been vetted by a lot of the schools that we work with, you just want to know what service you signed up for. You may not know what service you signed up for.
Yeah, and you can get a lot of different checks. So Hire Right, I know, is one of the ones that a lot of people use. Sterling's a lot of one. I know, I think NBOA, you even get a discount maybe with Hire Right. Don't quote me. I didn't say that. Sorry, Jeff Shields. Didn't mean to give a discount. But what I would suggest, I agree with Hope, and you know what, they can do a lot of different kinds of background checks for you. So sure, we keep talking criminal background checks. In reality, when you look at these situations, most of these people that misbehave didn't have anything on their criminal history. That's not where we're usually seeing it. You have to do it. You want to do it. It's malpractice if you're not doing a comprehensive criminal background check. But the other things you can get from them is they'll do your check on education. Because remember, what you're really looking when you're doing these background checks is, what are the red flags, right? So if someone says to you, you know, obviously we want to use an application, and that's on Hope's checklist. If you look at it, everybody should be using an employment application. Every single person in this room should have an employment application that everybody fills out before they come into your building, right? And why is that? Because for a number of reasons. First off, resumes are creative writing. Anybody can write whatever they want on a resume. It could be truthful, it could be not truthful. What an application does is lay out the questions that you want the answers to in a consistent way, right? And when the applicant has to fill that thing out, and you can put those online and get them filled out, they have to fill out the questions that you ask in the way that you want, so you're looking at apples to apples. And also at the bottom, it says if you lied, misrepresented, omitted, failed to disclose, then we can terminate you, or we don't have to let you go through the hiring process. So all of that's really important. Plus, you get permission to do some of these background checks. And you want to look at, if the application says, I went to Harvard education, I have a master's degree from the Harvard Education School, right? And then you want to do a check to confirm that that's true. Hire Right and these kinds of folks will do those checks for you, so you don't have to go through that whole process. So they'll do education, they'll do, what else can those guys do? They can do all kinds of checks for you. Social Security checks to see where someone has lived, for numerous years, so you can do your criminal background check. But use them, and they're cost efficient. You don't have the time or energy to go and call up Harvard to see if somebody went to their education program. You'd be shocked at how many times a resume says, I went to the Harvard Education School, and Harvard says, I have no idea of who you're talking about. And those are all red flags.
Right. So, and that's all on this checklist as well. So I encourage you to go through this. If
There's a question.
Yes.
Give
Thank
Cece
you.
her own.
Anne-Marie and I are taking the questions to everyone. Background check, questions, releases on application. From my understanding and what the laws are, you can't really do a background check until you offer someone a job, and the job is contingent upon that. So having it on the application and having all of that doesn't help with the candidates. What is it that we can do, screening candidates, if any, prior to offering a job.
You can do all these things we just chatted about. So first off, you want to make sure that you can have on your application, have you been convicted of a felony within the last such and such years? So you have that on there. There's also all of these other questions that they can answer for you, like, do you have, is what's on the application and what you get from the background? I mean, you can run the background without necessarily running the criminal piece of it right away, just to confirm all that other stuff, to make sure that it's consistent. Plus, you want to do reference checks. Reference checks are key, and we don't do reference checks in a consistent way and in a, not only consistent, but in a rigorous way to make sure that you have the information that you gather. I think there's a lot of things you can do other than the criminal background, which, I mean, you and I are arguing in some ways the same thing, that criminal background check's really important, but it's sort of the final check, if you will. Right? It's all those other things that we really want to make sure that we're doing.
Well, and the process for the reference check is really critical. I can't tell you how many times we at NYSAIS get phone calls from a head saying, this teacher just was hired by school XYZ, and nobody called us. Nobody even checked with us. And I'm always amazed that happens, that I get those calls. Because that is HR 101, that you've done that, and it's certainly that you go back more than one employer, so not just the person who they currently have, but go back a couple of steps.
And I think that argues for this whole idea of bringing together all the people that are involved in the hiring process. Because sometimes what you'll find, and Mark, you're absolutely right, I never cease to be amazed anymore, I think, because I hear these questions this all the time. I know I fired someone from a school, and I've heard another client hire the person. I mean, we had one, I might have told this story. We had this one person who we had to fire from 4 different schools, the same person from 4 different schools, because people just never called to get the reference check. By the end, the guy recognized our severance agreement because, we had used it in so many different schools. But again, that's why I think you need to bring everybody together as a team that's going to be doing this hiring, because you want everybody on board. And quite frankly, the reference checks, you're right, Mark, is one of the most important things you can do. I mean, we're going to share with NYSAIS our packet, and one of the things in our hiring packet is a form for reference checks, because you need to establish, we've agreed that on every applicant, we're going to do 4 reference checks, right? And you have to figure out at which point through the process you're going to do these reference checks, but here's what happens. You get these 3 references, right, from the applicant, and you put a call out, because you're busy, you put a call out, and you leave a message, and then you put a call out to the other one, and you put a call to the other one, but you keep putting these calls out, but you never get a call back, right? But you're busy, and in the back of your brain that you've put all these reference calls, but you don't have any references. But because we're so busy, we forget that we've put all these calls out. So what's really important is that you have some way that you're tracking your efforts to obtain these reference checks. Because what happens, I mean, you tell me, if you get a call from someone and you don't want to be giving a reference, what do? You don't call back. And those people that you're calling that don't call back, maybe it's because they don't want to give the reference. That is your reference. And because going back and thinking about this, if we have to defend, because I always look at this, how do I defend this? So as you said very wisely, you want to help set up your defense. And one of the things you want to be able to do is say, look, I did my due diligence before I hired this person. And so what did I do? I made sure that I got 3 references, and I noted down the references and what the person said and who I talked to. Because if, God forbid, something happens, a parent's going to say to you, wait a minute, how you brought this person into the school, introduced them to my child, and that person hurt my child, and it's your fault. You want to be able to say, look, I did my due diligence. I did everything I could to make sure that this person was safe. And here's what I did, right? And you look at your process, and if you can sleep at night thinking, this is all the stuff I did to make sure that everybody I brought into this school is safe, then you've done your job. And by having a form that says, here's the times I called the reference, here's what I did, I left a message, whatever, and here's what they said, that's another piece of evidence that defense counsel can use if they ever have to defend you on this case. Was there a question? There's a couple questions.
Couple questions. I think there's one over in the back, right over there.
Oh my God, Barbara, we got to get you some running shoes here.
So Caryn, my question is are there legal ramifications on these reference checks when you're, is it advisable to have the applicant sign off, giving permission for you to get that? Because a lot of times, you know, there's legal ramifications, I thought anyway, on what you can actually say on a reference check.
Well, yeah, I mean, I know what the argument or what's being asked is, you know, are there legal consequences if you give a bad reference, right? Because we're often afraid to really say the real thing because we're afraid the person's going to come back and bring a claim against us. Truth is a defense, right? So if in fact you have been speaking to this person for the last 3 years about boundaries and they still refuse to change, and you say the reason we terminated them is because they would not comply with boundaries, well, you have a way to defend yourself should you ever get, you know, a claim brought against you. Having said that, no one wants a claim against you. So yes, you can absolutely speak truthfully. Schools now are getting employees to sign a release that says, I give the school the right to speak freely about my performance while at the school. The problem is the people who don't want to be spoken about freely aren't going to give you permission. So you're still between a rock and a hard place.
There's your reference.
Yeah, you could say, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to give a reference. The person didn't give me a release. You know, look, we're speaking about a bigger problem, and it's a problem you've heard me speak about before, which is and we have to think of a different term. Pass the trash is not the right term. I mean, pass the problem, avoid the safety. I mean, I don't know what the term is, but, and you have to look in your own heart right now on that one, and I think we as educators have an obligation to make sure that we aren't passing along people that are problematic, because that's how we got to where we are today. So, you know, that's one, I defer to you on this, but
Sure, there's another pragmatic side to this. Everything comes back to insurance at the end of the day, don't you think?
it's all about insurance.
That applicant that you do a background check on in some way, or you do a reference check and you don't hire them, they often sue you for whatever the situation may be. That's our problem. We end up having to defend that for you. So one message I'd like to reiterate every time I'm with this group, if you give us a choice of defending the disgruntled employee or the disgruntled applicant, or defending a sexual abuse and molestation claim, we'll take the employment practices claim all day long. We're ready for that. So we're not going to criticize you in most predictable scenarios for taking a very conservative position with the goal of preventing a pedophile getting access to a child. The settlements are much lower, the handling of that is cheaper, and those claims are, quote, not held against you in as painful a way as if you err in the other direction.
And the injury is less. Yeah, I would agree, and I'm so happy to hear you have great insurance support here, because that's would be, you know, as legal counsel, that would be my argument as well.
Nancy, and then I think Robert had one also. Okay.
So now I'm leaving this session with my head spinning about all the things I have to do.
No.
Wait.
No.
So here's my question.
Nancy, did you also go to the Dazzle session too?
No. There are things that say establish best practice. Are you aware of the required action when a criminal conviction is discovered? What do you do if a current parent or an applying parent is a pedophile or is in the process of a litigation for a pedophile? So how do you make those decisions, and where do you get those answers once you know you have to have the best practices?
Yeah, it's the same answer. In some ways, it's every school, I mean, talk about culture. You've heard me say culture is queen, king, whatever. You have to act absolutely consistent with your culture on this parent thing. We have schools now around the country that are doing criminal background checks of all applicant parents as part of the application process. It's just what they are, it's just what they're doing. They've gotten stung. You know, you've heard me talk about this one case where a parent had a history of it, we didn't know about it, and then had a relationship with a student. I mean, it was a horrible situation. Not all schools are doing it. It's got a chilling effect, but as the head of school said to me, it has a chilling effect for the people who have a history of that. And for everybody else, they're going to be clean, so it's not going to be an issue for them. But what you have to really do is come up with your process, just like with the hiring process. And we have schools that do from, the wide range. Some schools absolutely refuse to let any student come to the school whose parent has a history of, inappropriate behavior with a minor, to some schools say, none of my business, we're not saying anything. I think most of our schools are somewhere in the middle where they put restrictions on this parent. And I mean, we're dealing with one right now, actually, in Baltimore, where the parent we accepted the kid, and the parent came forward and said, look, thank you for accepting my kid. Before we go down this road where we accept your offer, I'm on the sex offender registry. She was a teacher, had a relationship with a student, then, spent time in jail, came out, got married, had a child, and now this kid is a 7th grader and applied for the school. And she came forward and said, look, this is the story. Let's talk about this, because I don't want to accept this offer for my kid, and then you find out, and then we have to figure out what goes on. So, and there's lots of ways to build in boundaries. She can't come to the campus without an escort. No children can go to their house. There's no sleepovers. If anybody is going to go to their, you do this dance, but, go on my website, there's a whole PowerPoint just on that topic. Hope.
Question.
Other questions that anybody has at this point? Over there.
The background company that we use will often ask me, do you want me to check if the applicant puts his name as Mike?
I can't hear you. Can you talk a little bit louder?
Sure. If the applicant writes Mike on his application, do you want us to check Mike and Michael? Do you want me to check Mike and Michael and his middle initial? Do you want me to check he's lived in 5 states? Do you want me to check all 5 states? Do you want me to check the woman's name and her maiden name? And often it's my judgment call, and it'll come down to how much money I have to spend, and I don't think that's the right way to
Yeah, I don't know
decision.
who you're using. Usually what I see is that it's a packet that you buy. Is that what everybody else does? It's a packet? Yeah, so it's a packet, and you can, there's a checklist. 1 from column A, 2 from column B, and you pick and choose what you want, whether or not you want educational. And I think get the educational one. If you don't do that, I don't know what you think about, the educational one to me is huge, because we find stuff that is unbelievable when we truly do these educational backgrounds. But you want to make sure, so we don't want to just do New York, right? We want to do lots of states, every place that the person has lived. Because if they're here in New York, trying to get a job with you in New York, chances are good that they're not on the sex offender registry, but that doesn't mean they're not on the sex offender registry in Utah. So you want to make sure that you pick your things and consistently do it across the board, whatever your package that you're picking is. I strongly recommend that you do a registry check, criminal background check and a registry check going back 10 or 15 years, and making sure even longer than that if you want. Some states don't allow you to go back that long, but in New York we can. And what you want to do is the way it works is they fill out a form that gives all the different states they've lived in, the social security number, their driver's license number, all kinds of other information, various aliases, names, maiden names, current names, future names. And then you want to make sure you do that social security check, because sometimes people don't disclose all the places they've actually lived or have contact in, and that social security check will really give you all that information. And then let them run it, and you're pretty comprehensive. Again, that criminal piece is important, very important, but I just want to make sure that no one's walking away thinking, because we definitely have it in the best practice, but I want you to realize that's one of the many pieces that we really want to make sure that you're doing. Did that help? Answer? Confuse?
And we know that this entire topic is daunting, and we know that it is large. and which is why NYSAIS has put this into the categories for you. So we think that hopefully we'll break it into smaller chunks. So what is your hiring practice? And have you looked at your hiring practice? Do you have a consistent hiring practice? How do you do your background checks? What happens if you have someone who pops up on the registry? Have thought through all those pieces. And then looking at then the boundary establishments. How does that work? How do you enforce boundaries? That's a whole other topic. And we've tried to give you, through the principles of best practice, the checklist. Look at these things, take each one of these, break them into smaller pieces, have your administrative team and your faculty spend time looking and discussing each of these and how does this work at your school, knowing that there's not one answer here. But the idea is that you've done your due diligence, that you have done everything that you can, you've taken decisive steps to prevent this type of thing. I think we had a question over here someplace. Do we have another question?
Yeah, the other piece that's really helpful is to have one central person that is sort of the keeper. So in other words, you might have division heads that interview and run a search, and all different people around your school that run various searches, but there should be one person that's the keeper of all this. And I think, HOPE is great at checklists, and that's what should be done possibly, what can be done that's really helpful is you create the checklist for yourself of all the things that has to happen, whether it's your HR person that keeps it or someone in the business office or somewhere else. And so that every applicant that comes through, all of these things have to have happened. And you just put that, check it off so you have consistency. Remember, when you do this, it is also going to help with the failure to employ case. That's not the term. Failure to employ, failure to hire case. So basically, if you get a claim that's, oh, you didn't hire me because I don't know, whatever, pick your, your protected category, you can say, oh, no, here's the process that we went through. We went through the same process with every single person. But to have one person watching to make sure, because everyone knows, like, your division head really wants this person, so they're going to jerry-rig the system to make sure they get that one person. If you have a process in effect, then you can avoid that kind of stuff too.
Well, and some of the schools have very decentralized hiring processes. So you might have a division head who's doing that, or a department chair who's doing that, or whoever is doing the hiring. But does that have you as the HR person given them the tools? These are the things. Yes, you get to make this decision, however the school does it. But here's your checklist of things that you should be doing. Here it is. This should be consistently applied to all candidates, and helping them develop their HR skills. And have you done the training for the people who are doing the interview process or the background check process or whatever that happens to be?
Yeah, you picked on that good word. Training is very key.
Yeah.
And also as we all know, it's always helpful to be able to say, well, that's just great, because if you haven't gone through the whole process, you can't hire. Until all of these things are met, you can't hire. Now, we can't always do that, but, and the message has to really come from the head of school. And I know that you're going to be doing work with the head of schools on this.
Yeah, so that leads us to some of the final people. Ellen, I see a question back here. Go ahead.
Are you guys going to get to the fingerprinting? Because that's my question.
Yeah, so we can talk about the fingerprinting now if you want to.
Let's talk about, wait, I think we have another, Victor?
Victor.
I think it's important for you.
Wait.
Hold on.
I think it's important for you, if you could just backtrack on what you can ask about someone's background on their application versus, what hiring decision you can make, right? Because I think that there are a lot of people who are under the understanding that you can't ask them anything, right? New York City law changed, right? And I think it's important that you explain what we can or can't ask, because I think some people are under the impression that you can't ask anyone about their criminal background until you make them an offer.
Right. So Victor, that's a great question. I'm going to take you back to that checklist. And that checklist that we created, as you go through it, and it will be on the NYSAIS website, as you go through it, there are legal and illegal interview questions. There's an application form on there. So all of those resources that you're asking about will be available on there for you to use.
But he's saying like, someone gave me their applicant questionnaire, but he said to me, you can't use that in New York City, because I ask questions that you're not allowed to ask in New York City.
So we know, because we have a lot of clients in New York City, there's some specific regulations there, what you can put on your application, what you can ask in your interviews. We're taking that into account as well. So we know. Yeah.
So it's the what you can and you can't ask, and there's great lists of what you can and you can't ask. So we also, we'll give you, we'll also make sure that we put our what you can and you can't ask. In terms of the criminal background, it gets a little dicey. And again, the problem is if you go, what you can affirmatively state what your standards are with regard to criminal backgrounds. And so if the standard is, if you are on any, pedophile registry, you can't get a job here. You want to make sure that and that's standard because you're not allowed to anyway, but you want to make sure that you put that in your material somewhere so people know, hey, if this comes up, we're not going to offer you this job.
Is part of it, Caryn, is part of it that it has to be job-related? So there has to be some nexus between the question and actual tasks or jobs in the job description. Is that part of what drives some of this?
It is, because that's for your discrimination issues, it is, because there's got to be a nexus between the criminal offense and the job that the person's performing. Having said that, if you're let's say you're in the business office. Even if you're in the business office, you still have contact with kids. So we're still not letting anyone in the business office who's on any sex offender registry. Now, if someone, I don't know if anybody's doing financial background checks for somebody that's in your offices. You can do sort of financial checks, right? And a lot of us do, with the theory that, look, you have access to money, and if you have a history of committing fraud, we may not want you in the financial office, though sometimes we do, however you operate. But if you have that and you're a teacher, is that job related? And that's always the question. Right. I would advise not to have someone that's got fraud in your business office.
Quick follow-up question. A lot is focused on new hires, and we do stringent background check on hiring and financial and all sorts of everything that we know what we are doing. What do you suggest, and it probably is a whole session to itself, what do we do with our existing employees? I could become an issue with pedophile or a financial issue during the course of my employment. I may be employed 25 years and it happened the last 5 years. What is the suggestion and protection?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question.
Good segue to fingerprint.
Yeah, it segues beautifully to fingerprinting, actually.
Thank you,
So thank you, Cece, for the segue. One of the reasons we put into the best practices is that fingerprinting, first of all, for new hires, in which we've been spending a lot of time talking about them, but then the other areas are existing employees. What do you do with them? And the reason that NYSAIS recommends in the principle of best practice using the New York State system, the TEACH system, is because once you are in the TEACH system and your school is linked to the TEACH system, if a flag pops up a year after you've done the fingerprinting, then the flag comes to you, and you get that notification through the TEACH system about exactly what you're saying. So, keeping in mind that the past practices have been, you've done some type of background check. You get a snapshot in time, you see what happened with that employee, you know everything from there backwards, but you really don't know anything moving forward. And that's been the weak spot that all the schools have had by not being in a system such as the TEACH system that then gives you flags in the future should something occur. So that's why we did put it into the best practice and we also recognize that some schools, this is a large undertaking. Schools that have already had allegations or dealt with allegations, I can tell you right now, they already have done it. They've already gone back and said, we're never going to let this happen to us again as an organization. We feel bad about what happened to our students. We have an obligation to protect students. So many of the schools that have been through down this path have already implemented the requirement that all existing employees are fingerprinted. So we put in a timeline of 2020. Certainly, if you wanted to do it faster, that would be great. It would give you and your board and your head and your administration more confidence that you are aware of what's happening with current employees moving forward. The 2018 of the new hires, again, is a timeline that we've created for you. I'll make a distinction here. This is a principle of best practice. This is not a accreditation requirement. So there really are, this is saying, this is what our association says for our member schools is the best practice. You as a school can make your decisions about this. We're saying this is what you should be doing, which gives you then something very defensible, that you've actually created the environment in which you're making sure that those people are being properly vetted by your school. That being said, in our principles of best practice, often, and we anticipate with this one, NYSAIS does anticipate this, that some of these will probably move into the accreditation realm. That at some point we are probably going to say, this is a requirement of accreditation, because, and not all of this, but there will be some key pieces in here, as we've done with other principles of best practice over the years, who've eventually moved into accreditation if it's very significant. And some of these will, I'm sure, move into that. We actually have a task force that will be looking at this from the Commission on Accreditation.
Hey, Mark, real quick. We had a question on the live stream. How quickly do you get information back from the TEACH system?
It's not.
Yeah, so well, what we've been told is that you'll get information back within 5 to 7 days. That their turnaround is quite quick.
It depends when it is, actually, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in the busy season, it's going to be a little bit longer. If it's, you know, outside the busy season, but we're all obviously looking for it during the busy season. But I think 5 to 7, even in the busy season, is pretty much what you see.
That's what they say.
Can you describe the process, Hope?
So we're not that familiar with the TEACH process. I know there are other people in this room who are, though, but our understanding was their turnaround time was about a day. Yeah, 24 hours is their turnaround time.
How many of you are currently using TEACH? How many in the room? Anyone? Okay.
Yeah, so Tricia has done some research on it, and she has her username and password.
Great.
So she's gone through that process.
Great.
The TEACH system's mostly been used, I believe, with the public schools, so I think that's why we're not so educated on it, but that's certainly something we're looking to do.
But do you use it? Yeah, I thought you did, yeah. I mean, you use it, a lot of schools use it because of the coaches, because you have to go through, right? How do you find, do you like it?
Actually, my HR person does it all. I don't know.
Yes.
I know it's very time consuming to get in the original fingerprinting, and your hand, if it's too big, doesn't work.
Keeping in mind that the way Horace Mann did this, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Bud, is that you actually bought the equipment and you actually were doing the fingerprinting.
That's correct.
At your school.
But you don't have to do that.
But you don't have to do that. There are places all over the state that do that, and so there's a lot of locations throughout the state, so they'll take care of that for you. Some of the larger
we have a lot
schools,
of employees,
it's better.
Well, and also part of the reason you did it was the coaches, right? I mean, part of the reason Bud did it because of all the coaches that are used, and it's helpful because of, again, being part of the bigger leagues. You need to have those done. But it is a good and effective system. I'm glad that that was one of the recommendations.
So we have a few more minutes for just a few questions, so let's start over here.
If you do fingerprinting, do you still have to do the criminal background check?
Well,
go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
There's different levels and styles of fingerprinting as part of the problem. You could, for example, approach Sterling, a private vendor, and have them coordinate a fingerprinting background check process with you. Or you can use the TEACH system, which accomplishes what most folks in our business, in the insurance industry, would say is the gold standard of a criminal background check. That it's not just looking for a pedophile issue, it's looking for any other convictions and automatic notification to you as the employer and so forth. So if you're using TEACH, most folks would say you've done a criminal background check and the broadest, best one available.
So you're saying, no, you don't have to do both?
I don't know of a case to be made, maybe others would say differently, but our industry has always said that if you do that program, participate in it, then going and doing, say, a private background check with ADP is redundant.
So, and I think it always distills down to, do you have confidence in the background check that you did to say, if you're on a witness stand someplace, we did everything and we were very confident in our process. Did it cover it? Did TEACH give you enough? Or did you want to do some of the other background checks on the academic side and some of the other pieces, the flags that Caryn has talked about? Have you done that? That would probably, I would say that combination of those things, whether it's coming from Sterling or whoever it's coming from, or TEACH, gives you the confidence, say, okay, I'm comfortable putting this person in front of those children and having contact with those kids. Question right here.
It's my understanding with the Teach that when you fill out an application, you can only do all new or prospective employees, but not existing, which comes to the question is, if we wanted to do all existing by 2020, how would we go about that? Would we use a Sterling? Are we doing this yearly? Because we won't have access to the Teach system for those people.
I'm not sure. Maybe you know enough about, I don't know enough about Teach in terms of, and it's probably one of the things we should really look into, Mark, and help be able to provide that information. But, the question always becomes, okay, so now we have all the new applicants and we've tested them, but how about our current ones that we haven't? And how is it that we do that? Can we do all of our current applicants? Our current employees, can we require them to be criminal background checked? And if we do, how do we do it? And what happens if someone says, no, I'm not going to be criminally background checked, and that's our requirement? Can we terminate them? So that's a bigger, whole nother conversation that we should definitely...
And some of the schools have dealt with that, where they've actually gone back. Do you want to address this, Michael?
And I think we have someone with some special expertise. Matt, I don't want to speak for you. For those of you who don't know Matt in the back of the room, he came from a long charter school background, which is sort of connected to New York State and background checks that happen almost like in the public school environment. So I'm guessing you've got something to add here, Matt.
That's exactly right. So I was with a group of charter schools for about 10 years, and we used Teach the whole time. And a lot of what I've heard is correct. You typically find out within a day or two if the person is cleared. The biggest issues we had were in transferring the fingerprints from whoever was taking them into the state system. And so that's where you'd sometimes run into some snags, and that would hang you up for a few weeks. Addressing, though, the issue of existing employees, typically the way that Teach works is you just go into the system and enter their social security number, and then they're connected to your school. And so there's really nothing that's stopping you from just entering all your existing employees into that system and getting them cleared through Teach.
And keeping in mind, anybody who has a credential, of course, is already in the system, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, great question.
So Matt's going to be consulting afterward for a small fee.
Matt, do you want to give everybody your phone number so they can call you?
Is the Teach system only for New York State, or is it federal?
State. State, isn't it? No. It doesn't tie into the whole federal, but it's done through New York State, right?
But all the information...
It's done through New York State, but I do believe they check federal records.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. And in response to Nancy's question, which is a good one, the only thing I can think is, different background check companies do different kinds of checks. So some just do the state check, some do local checks, some do the federal check. There's also this, a lot of these background check companies have like this database, basically, which is all the different states in the country, all the different localities, everything you can buy or you can rent or you can own or you can download, and it's sort of one big bucket. They call it different things. And when they can run someone's social security number through that big bucket, that's really, really valuable, because sometimes you didn't live in the place that you were a pedophile. So it wouldn't necessarily come up just based on your social security background. And I can't speak enough about Teach. I mean, that's probably a good project for us to help look into, to see whether or not it's as comprehensive as some of these other, background checks.
And one of the things that's been suggested is at some point maybe NYSAIS develop some type of consortium pricing or something like that. That would go across all the schools, at all NYSAIS schools. We'd contract with one of the top firms that does this kind of work and look at creating a NYSAIS price. So we are very interested in doing that to support you. We know how important this is, and we know that it'd be good to have some type of consistency across the entire state. Knowing that NYSAIS schools, by doing this, are going way beyond what's legally required, but not beyond the professional standards that are done within the public schools, with the charter schools. So we have elevated the security for the kids by doing this process. Question.
Mark, one other thing to do with the cost is we've talked with a lot of people who work with the Department of Investigation in New York City, and they actually have the applicants pay for the cost because all the results follow them. So it's something to take into consideration too.
And I think we've had some schools that have done that.
Passing the cost.
The cost of all of this is passed to the future
I
employee.
guess wage and hour, I don't know if we care for all of this.
This is not employment law.
Okay, good. I think we have time for one or two questions.
Most of the people in the building will have some interaction with students, so is there any subset of employees that you should not do fingerprinting on?
I think that Caryn, maybe you might want to address this also, but it seems to me that the criteria should be, will they have a contact with the kids and interaction with the kids in some way? And I think your first point was the legitimate point. Most will. So again,
Coaches, any of your people that come in to do your after-school programs, anybody you're using as a chaperone on any of your trips that isn't normally part of your staff, parents that, I would definitely do parents that are going on trips, and especially any of your international trips. Sometimes we bring in a spouse. I don't know if there's any any boarding schools in here, but anybody, any spouse or anybody that lives in any of the boarding, any of the dorms, look, I drop the net wide. Test everybody.
So just to clarify, you're saying that it doesn't matter if they're an actual employee. They could be an independent contractor, they could be a volunteer, it could be anyone who has contact. They don't actually have to be applying for a job?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, my theory on this is, to the extent that we can do some sort of background check from a criminal perspective on anybody that comes in, at a minimum, so that we know they're not on the registries, but in a broader way, like with the people that, anybody that's going on and again, it depends on how close relationship they are with the kids. If you are sending a parent on an international trip, then I would like to see, a pretty comprehensive background check done, criminal background check done.
Yeah, Bob.
What do you do with your food vendor or cleaning service who they say they're vetted?
I don't care.
And do you say we need to background check everyone, fingerprint everyone?
Yeah, and you know what, you've raised, Bob, you raised a really great point, because one of the things I always say when you're talking about looking at vendors, like food service vendors, that is a good question that you want to be asking these food service vendors. So tell me what the background checks process you use before you hire anyone. And hear what they say, and you will be surprised at what different vendors do. I mean, we work with one vendor that we've helped develop their background process, and it is rigorous. And one of the reasons I always say you should talk, I won't tell you who it is, but you should talk to these people, is because I know that they're as committed to safety as you are, because they do that kind of background check on anybody that comes in. The other question is, find out, when someone doesn't show up for work, who is it that comes in and serves as the sub? Is it just anybody they bring in, or is it someone that's also gone through that same vetting process? So as far as I'm concerned, yeah, it's anybody that, think about it, the folks that do your cleaning, they're there after school at night when teachers aren't around, but do you have kids that stay after school for sports? Sure, it's those, or do they go to the bathroom? Are they in classrooms? Are they maybe in the locker room? Those folks more than maybe than anybody. And it's like I said, I mean, maybe full circle, like I said at the start, really sit back, take your calm time, and think about your whole school. And where are all those people that wander around your school, and where do they come in, and where do they go out, and where do they have contact with kids? I mean, I know it's a big, get your little app, do a little meditation, and then do the thought. Can you tell where I was last week?
I think maybe we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
We also do the tutors. We don't pay for them, but they are allowed to come.
I love you, absolutely.
We do for them.
Anybody that comes in, yeah.
Their background.
Anybody that comes in, it's interesting you said that about the tutors, because we have a lot of schools, and I'm sure there's some schools here, where the parent, you provide a space, right? But the parent provides the tutor. And one of the things this school is doing is saying, great, you want to provide your own tutor, happy day, they want to use their space, you need to pay for the background check.
This year we're doing that. We are passing on.
Right.
We're right at the end of time. Victor, I know you have a question. Go ahead. You can be our last question, Victor.
Okay. What advice do you have for us for scenarios where we terminate a teacher, or a teacher suddenly resigns and we need to cover a period, and it has to be the person that we're about to hire, and we're running a little behind with the background process? because it does take a few days. Okay.
But the question is, someone left and you're about, because they leave in August before the school year starts?
No, so over winter break, I'll give you an example. Over winter break,
You need an immediate fill-in.
we terminated a teacher.
Right, you need an
And-
immediate fill-in.
Yes, and we needed to fill in immediately, and there were all sorts of pressures on us to let the teacher start while the background was pending, and they bought a background from the university where they were working at, and and we said no, and it brought us like all sorts of hell.
It's a risk-benefit analysis. You've heard me, I feel like I say the same darn things every time, but they work. It's a risk-benefit analysis. How much risk for how much benefit? Sure. This person is going to fill in that spot, and it might be the person you want, but the risk, is that what that person brings that you don't know? Is it worth that benefit to have that person in that spot if the potential risk is, and again, that's the assessment that you have to make when you go through any of these things. I think this is always helpful to have, the heads of schools.
Well, and keep in mind
involved in
that you've heard that with the TEACH system that you can have a turnaround within a day or two. So again, if you're already in the system, you've already done the whole process, the OSPRI 106 form, and you're already in the system, then you have a reasonably good potential of having it turned around rather quickly. I know this has been a big topic. I just want to thank all of you for staying until noon on our last day. This is really terrific. I want to thank our panel for being here. Can we give them a big round of applause?